Welcome to the HR Tech Nexus Podcast, the go-to resource for small and mid-sized businesses ready to revolutionize recruiting and onboarding. Twice a week, we deliver actionable, budget-friendly tech strategies to help you compete for top talent globally without enterprise-level costs. If you're drowning in manual hiring tasks, battling compliance headaches, or stuck with clunky HR systems, you're in the right place. We break down tools like AI-driven applicant trackers, seamless onboarding platforms, and compliance automation, all scaled for SMEs. Join me as we unpack real-world strategies from HR leaders who've slashed time to hire, boosted retention, and built future-ready teams.
All right. Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive here. This is our 13th one. And
13. Lucky number 13.
I guess so, right? Hopefully. Today, we're going to be diving into HR data privacy compliance, which, as you know...
It's a big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. It's kind of a... if you're running a small to medium-sized enterprise, you're probably looking at GDPR in Europe and CCPA here and thinking, okay, what is all this really about for, how I actually run my HR department?
Yeah, I mean, it can seem like a maze, right? You're just focused on your people, growing your business.
Yeah.
And then you have all this legal stuff to deal with.
And the fines.
The fines, exactly. And we're going to get into that. But it's really so much more than that. And that's what we're going to try to unpack today using, some of the great material from HR Tech Nexus's guide. Really make it, clear and manageable and actually show you how your good data protection can be a real asset.
Okay, yeah. Let's dive right in. So, obviously everybody wants to avoid fines and, the reputational damage that can come with that. But I think for a smaller company, what are some of the big reasons why you really need to be prioritizing this?
Well, you're right. The fines and the potential for reputational damage, that's huge. You can't ignore that. But I think one of the most important things is trust, right? Think about your employees. They're trusting you with some of the most sensitive information, and when you actively protect that data, it builds a level of credibility. It strengthens that trust within your organization.
Right. It's really about building that foundation with your employees.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, obviously HR is right at the center of all of this, with all the employee data that they manage. Why is HR so central to making this work?
It's all about the data that flows through the HR department, right? It's pretty much everything from, job applications.
Yeah.
So you've got their contact details, their work history, and then all the way through performance reviews, salary information, sometimes even health information. HR teams are dealing with incredibly valuable private data every single day.
Yeah, no, it really does run the gamut. Pretty much every aspect of someone's work life is going to touch the HR department in some way.
Right.
So with all of that in mind, what are some of the things that HR really needs to be responsible for and thinking about on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, there's a lot to cover, but let's break it down. I think first and foremost, it's making sure that the way they're collecting and processing data is lawful, it's transparent. What that really means is only collecting information that they genuinely need for legitimate business reasons. If they need consent, making sure they're getting proper consent and being completely upfront with their employees about how that data is going to be used.
Right. Making sure everyone is, fully aware and on board with everything.
Absolutely. And then the other big thing is understanding, the regulations, things like GDPR, CCPA, not just reading them, but really knowing how to apply them within their work.
It really is taking it from the page to, day-to-day practice.
Yeah, and that's where it gets tricky for a lot of companies, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And then alongside that is security, putting in place strong security measures. So encryption, making sure the data is basically scrambled so only the right people can access it. And then having those clear policies, for data retention. How long do we keep this? And then when we get rid of it, how do we dispose of it securely?
Right, because you don't want to just be holding on to this stuff forever.
Exactly. And, along with the actual processes, it's also about education, right? Making sure that every single employee in the company understands their role in data privacy and the responsibility that comes with that. It's fostering that culture of data security where it's just top of mind for everyone.
It really is about the entire company working together, not just, HR doing their thing.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for HR to collaborate with the other departments, particularly IT and legal.
Right. To make sure everyone is on the same page.
Yeah, that's right.
So, obviously we've talked about some of the challenges, but what are some of the, kind of the common roadblocks that you see HR departments and SMEs facing?
Well, the first one, it's probably no surprise. It's just the complexity of the regulations.
Yeah.
GDPR, it's constantly being interpreted. We have new regulations popping up all the time, like CPRA in California. Trying to keep up with that changing legal landscape, it's a lot. It takes, ongoing education, willingness to adapt your processes.
Yeah, it's not something you can just, learn once and then forget about.
Absolutely not. And then, the other thing is, you're a small to medium-sized enterprise. You're probably using, external vendors for a lot of things, payroll, benefits, you name it.
Right.
And that can be a big challenge, making sure that those third parties are also meeting the data privacy standards.
Yeah. It's one thing to, do it in-house, but how do you make sure that everybody you work with is on the same page?
Right. And then there's the balance, between privacy and transparency, especially when you're dealing with things like health records. You want to be transparent, but you also have to protect people's privacy.
Right. It's a tricky line to walk.
Yeah, it really is. And then, of course, we can't forget about remote work. That's added a whole other layer of complexity.
Yeah.
Ensuring secure data transmission and access. People working on all these different devices and locations.
Yeah, it's a whole new world. So, I think the big question then becomes, what are some things that SMEs can actually do? What are some best practices to, actually improve all of this?
Yeah. HR Tech Nexus's guide has some really great points on this. I think one of the most important things is having clear data protection policies, really spelling out how are we collecting data, how are we using it, storing it, deleting it, and making those policies readily available and understandable to all employees.
Right, because if they can't understand it, it's not going to do much good.
Exactly. And I think doing regular risk assessments is also vital, taking a close look at your data handling practices, trying to identify any weak points.
Yeah, almost like a proactive audit before anything goes wrong.
Yeah. Exactly. Try and find the vulnerabilities before they become a problem. And then, there's some really interesting technologies out there that can help with all of this, things like AI-based redaction, which can automatically blur out sensitive details in documents, or, just strong encryption, making sure that data is scrambled and protected.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times when people think about this, they're thinking about, physical documents being left around. But really, the digital side is just as important, if not more so.
Right. And then alongside that, I think regularly auditing your data handling practices is so important, just to make sure that you're actually following your own policies and the regulations, having that ongoing check.
Yeah. And it's something that, again, you can't just do once and forget about. It's an ongoing process.
Absolutely. And I think, going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's fostering that culture of privacy, through regular training awareness programs, just making sure that everyone understands the importance of this.
And that it's a shared responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just on HR, it's on everyone.
Okay, so you've mentioned, GDPR and CCPA a few times. Without getting too lost in the legal weeds, what are some of the core things about these regulations that, SMEs really need to be aware of?
Yeah, so GDPR, which applies in the European Union, it's really about, handling personal data lawfully and fairly. Some of the key principles there are data minimization, only collecting what you need, and a big emphasis on individual rights. So, for example, under GDPR, your employees, they have the right to request access to all the personal information that you hold on them.
So it's about, giving individuals more power over their data.
Exactly. And then you, as a company, you need to be able to provide that information in a clear and understandable format. They also have the right to have that data corrected if it's wrong, or even erased in some circumstances. Wow. So there's a lot of, responsibility on the company side to make sure they're complying with that. That's right. And then here in the U.S., CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and its update CPRA, the California Privacy Rights Act, they put a big emphasis on privacy rights, particularly for employees. And a key thing for SMEs to understand there is the need to handle those requests. If an employee says, hey, I want to see my data, or I want you to delete my data, you need to be set up to to handle that in the right way.
Okay, so for somebody listening to this who is maybe running an SME or in charge of HR, what are some things that they can do, today to really start making improvements?
I would say the first thing is just take a good hard look at what you're already doing. How are you collecting data? Are you collecting more than you need? Do you have a good reason for holding on to every piece of information? And then secondly, make sure your employees understand their rights and your company's policies. Regular communication is so important. And then think about, do you have a process in place to handle those requests from employees if they want to access or delete their data? Do you know how you would respond to that? And then fourth, look at your third-party vendors. Do they have strong data privacy practices? Are they aligned with yours? And then finally, some basic security measures can go a long way. Encrypt your sensitive files. Make sure you have secure procedures for getting rid of paper documents.
So, it sounds like it's a lot, but there are steps you can take that are manageable, that you don't have to do everything at once.
That's right. You don't have to boil the ocean. Just take it step by step.
So to kind of, wrap all of this up, it sounds like, data privacy, it's not just a box to check. It's really about, building a better company.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, what's so interesting is that, if you take this seriously and you're proactive about it, it can become a real competitive advantage. Mm-hmm. In a world where data breaches are happening all the time, if you can show your employees, hey, we're taking this seriously, we're protecting your information, that goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for everyone listening, I think the big question is, how prepared is your team? How ready are you to deal with all of this?
It's definitely something to think about. And if you, want to learn more about this or just stay up to date on, HR tech in general, HR Tech Nexus is a fantastic resource.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a wealth of information. So, I think that's a great place to leave it for today. This has been a deep dive into, HR data privacy compliance, and I think we've shown that it's really about so much more than just, checking boxes. It's about building trust and creating a better company.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So thanks for joining us, everybody. We hope you got a lot out of this, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of HR tech.
See you next time.
Thanks for joining us on the HR Tech Nexus podcast. Ready to take action? Head to hrtechnexus.com to access today's episode resources, including actionable guides, real-world case studies, and free tools to streamline your hiring and onboarding. Don't miss our weekly newsletter for bite-sized HR tech hacks, software comparisons, and compliance tips tailored to SMEs. No enterprise-level budgets required. And if you're ready to transform your HR workflows with custom-built solutions, book a free discovery call with our experts. We design strategies that fit your company's size, industry, and global needs. Until next time, innovate boldly, outsmart the status quo, and let's build HR teams that don't just compete, they dominate.